Lumpson.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the Taxation, Annual Rates, Returns Filing and Remedial Matters Bill. Mr Speaker, the first thing this bill does, of course, is it sets the annual tax rates for the 2012-13 tax year. And the setting of those annual tax rates sets in place, or fixes in place, the great so-called tax switcheroo that the government introduced. Now, if you remember the tax switcheroo that the government introduced, which was meant to pull the wool over people's eyes, it was meant to trick people. It obviously tricked David Bennett because, it'd be a pretty easy job, you'd have to say. But, I mean, the idea of the tax switch was that they would decrease the taxes on upper income earners, which they did, and the exchange would be that they would increase GST. And so what that would mean is that ordinary New Zealanders would pay by having increased GST on their groceries. Every time you go to the supermarket, you have to pay a little bit more GST. You pay a little bit more GST so that those who are at the very upper end of the income scale can have tax cuts. So it meant a 5% tax cut, effectively, for those at the top end. So if you earned $1 million a year, then what the National Party did, the John Key, John Banks government did, was that they gave you a 5% tax cut. So if you earn $1 million a year, you were given an extra $50,000, or about $1,000 a week. Now, of course, that money's got to come from somewhere. And so the way that the John Key, John Banks government organised this was that they said, oh, well, ordinary New Zealand mums and dads, Kiwi mums and dads, well, every time they go to the supermarket to buy their groceries, they can pay extra GST on those groceries. And that is the heart of the tax switcheroo. What it meant was a big tax cut for upper income earners, very significant if you're on $1 million a year, $50,000 a year tax cut, $1,000 a week. Thank you very much, John Key, John Banks. But if you were a middle income earner, then you had to pay increased GST to cover that cost. Now, aside from the sheer inequity of that tax switch, the old tax switcheroo, which is at the heart of this bill that we're considering in front of us, aside from the sheer inequity, the sheer unfairness of a system which says that we're going to give big tax cuts to those at the very top and we're going to pay for it by taxing ordinary New Zealanders more through the GST, aside from the sheer inequity, they said it would be fiscally neutral, broadly fiscally neutral, so the government told us. Of course, it has been no such thing. It is not fiscally neutral. At no point was it fiscally neutral. In fact, the revenue lost was probably something in the order. It's very hard to get the numbers out of the government because the government is very shifty on these issues. It is the John Key, John Banks government, after all. It's very hard to get the numbers, but it's probably about $2 billion. That's the deficit. So instead of being fiscally neutral, as we were told at the time, in fact it's cost maybe $2 billion so far. Now, if that's the case, then that means an extra $2 billion has had to go on the government credit card. We've had to borrow that money to cover the tax switch that is implicit in this bill. So on the one hand, the government introduced changes which made our tax system much less fair by taking money away from middle-income earners and giving it to upper-income earners. And on the other hand, they made the fiscal position of the government much worse. They made the deficit worse. So that was the heart of the government's great tax shift policy that is put in place by this bill. Now, Mr Speaker, for that reason, the Green Party won't be voting for this bill. We think that this bill is fundamentally unjust and unfair because it sets tax rates that are fundamentally unjust and unfair. But most of all, Mr Speaker, this bill is part of the government's overall economic package, their dumb, dirty, grey economic package. So instead of having smart green economics, the direction that the world is heading, the 21st century economics that we should be embracing as a country, smart green economics, what this John Key, John Banks government is giving us is dumb, grey, dirty economics. The economics of the 19th century, when we should be embracing the economics of the 21st century. That is what this tax package is part of. So instead of seeing a tax shift which would be progressive, such as moving tax onto capital gains, which is highly progressive, what we're seeing is actually increased taxes on the poor and cutting taxes on the wealthy. Instead of seeing a tax shift which would reduce the taxation pressure on ordinary people and actually put a carbon charge in place, what this government is doing is spending about $1.5 billion a year to subsidise greenhouse pollution via the ETS. And instead of this government introducing some kind of resource rental, so for example around water, which is one of our most important resources, which could then take some of the pressure off the tax system, so we wouldn't see the kind of tax rates that we're seeing in this bill, the government is doing nothing about water. And in fact, what it's doing is giving away the rights to water for free. So irrigators who use water and make billions of dollars out of water, literally, they don't have to pay anything for the use of that water. And instead of having a smart green economic future where we would actually increase savings and would support KiwiSaver, and an automatic enrolment system would be part of that in order to increase the number of people who are getting into KiwiSaver and so increase our savings, the government backed away from automatic enrolment in KiwiSaver because it said it cost too much. And of course the reason why it couldn't afford it was it gave away so much money in tax cuts to upper income earners that it couldn't afford to make the kind of structural change that we need to make in the economy to actually increase the amount that we're putting into savings through KiwiSaver. And so auto-enrolment didn't happen. The other part of it, of course, that's missing in terms of a taxation policy is the government's decision to borrow to pay for the rebuild and, of course, to put a levy on just the people of Christchurch. So it's government policy now that the people of Christchurch will pay an earthquake levy through their rates, and the government will borrow to pay for some of the rebuilding costs, but there won't be across the country temporary targeted earthquake levy or a tax, as the Minister as Jerry Brownlee quite rightly identified it, which is fair enough. A temporary targeted earthquake levy that could have been used to take some of the pressure off the government's fiscal position to pay for the rebuild, which would have been fair, would have been spread across the whole country. Everybody would put in a few bucks, and it would have taken the pressure off the people of Christchurch and would have reduced government debt. Instead of that being part of this tax package, which it isn't, instead what we're seeing is that the government has actually put a levy through its rates on the people of Christchurch. So the very people who don't need extra burden at the moment, the John Banks government has put an extra levy on the people of Christchurch to pay for the rebuild, but the rest of the country hasn't worn it. Instead of having that as part of this package, they haven't had it there at all. And of course, in terms of dealing with the structural imbalances that underpin the poor economic performance of New Zealand since the 1980s and 90s New Right economic revolution, which has been an economic catastrophe for New Zealand, we haven't seen anything to address the overvaluation of the currency. So whether it's part of this bill or whether it's part of monetary policy, we haven't seen any attempt by this government to deal with the problem of the overvalued Kiwi dollar. And so in the middle of a currency war, this government just says, oh well, whatever is whatever, even though the Reserve Bank says we've got an overvalued currency, which is destroying the productive sector, even though all of the leading economists say we've got an overvalued New Zealand dollar, this government's doing nothing on it and sitting on their hands. Instead, what they are doing is they've gone on a spending splurge. So the spending splurge is really amazing. $12 billion or thereabouts on new motorways that have never been through Treasury's infrastructure criterion. So Treasury have a special thing. So they have a special set of rules. If you're going to invest in infrastructure, you're supposed to put it through Treasury's infrastructure rules. The roads of national significance, a $12 billion project, has never gone through Treasury's process. And then we have the $1.5 billion on greenhouse gas subsidies. We have the $120 million to $500 million cost of the asset privatisation program, still unquantified. The government won't say how much they're planning to spend on that. And of course the permanent impact of the privatisation of the assets is it means that the government's deficit is worse by $100 million a year, according to Treasury's Budget Policy Statement 2012. So that is the reality of this fiscally imprudent government. They have many, many hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to give away in tax cuts for upper income earners, to subsidise pollution on new motorways, to subsidise their asset sale program. And that's put the government books into a terrible hole. And so instead of getting the kind of smart green economic transformation that we need as a country, what we're getting is very poor economic management from a government that doesn't know how to manage the books. And what we're getting is a tax bill in front of us here, which basically cements in place the old tax switcheroo, which simply gave away large amounts of money to upper income earners and made middle income earners pay for it. The Green Party won't be supporting this bill, Mr Speaker.
Paul Goldsmith.
Well.